I'm Kelly Coleffel, your host. Every other week, we'll bring you insightful interviews with some of the brightest minds across the data community. We'll cover topics such as AI and ML, enterprise data and analytics, data culture, and a lot more. Today, I'm really pleased to be joined by Ajay Bidani. He's Data and Insights Manager at Powell Industries. Powell designs and manufactures electrical systems for large industrial customers such as oil and gas producers, refineries, and more around the world. Ajay has spent the last 17 years at Powell managing and developing and procuring enterprise applications. He's got a ton of experience here. More recently, his emphasis has been on performing technical alignment for time-saving automation and optimization and creating scalable architectures. Ajay, it's great to see you again. Welcome into the show.
Thanks, Kelly, for having me. It's been a while.
It has, yeah. It seems like we're going back. We've done this a couple of times together.
Yes, we have.
I tell you what, for folks who haven't heard us before, why don't you start with a quick overview? I talked about Powell just a little bit, but maybe a little more detail on Powell Industries, what you guys do, and then your current role at the company.
Sure. So we're a global company. We have three major locations in the U.S., Canada, and the U.K. We do manufacture in all three. We have equipment all over the world. We recently shipped equipment all the way, literally to the other side of the world, and had to work through a project in which we actually had to do the construction there. So the description is pretty apt as far as what we do, but the ways in which you have to do it and the people you have to work with to do it has definitely changes over time. But yeah, trying to keep up with technology and trying to be competitive is it's not easy.
Yeah, I've been around the manufacturing oil and gas industry a long time as well, and certainly those cycles that we go through in this industry. The need for data does not diminish during a down cycle. It certainly doesn't during an up cycle. You need it regardless of where the industry is overall. I'd love to spend the majority of this time really digging in a little bit on, with your experience, Ajay, building data teams, building the right data team as you go through migration and certainly modernization to do as much with your data as you can for Powell. Maybe kick things off. How have you organized your data team? How's it organized today? Where have you come from when you started to where you are today?
Sure. So when it comes to staffing, I'd say just having an experience with the business is a lot of where we tried to focus on is in whatever way you were supporting the business, having that to bring to the table. So that way the business sees you already as someone they can trust with the questions they have. And you're not fighting that gap of being someone who's overly technical, who doesn't know how to talk to them about the things that they're facing. So as we've gone forward, we were very much kind of a few people doing a lot and doing probably too much. And now we've really tried to say, what is the core things that my team needs to be good at to make the business successful when it comes to data? And what are those capabilities that the business needs to be empowered to do more because they can do it better than us and they can get to answers faster if we're really good at enabling them and they're really good at telling us what they're looking for. And we get that kind of collaboration process better than just going after it simply from tools perspective.
You've got your team within Powell, but how much is that notion of democratizing, kind of spreading out? We've almost got these virtual team members across the business. Really interested in that from an organization standpoint as well.
Right. I mean, most of us grew up on things like Excel, and we were used to plugging the gaps for ourselves using Excel when it came to questions. So there are a lot of people who are already familiar with the idea of working with data. It's just that those efforts are so isolated from each other at times. I mean, some people are really great at it, but oftentimes they're very isolated. So there is a lot of duplicate work. There are a lot of duplicate questions being answered, and there's not necessarily alignment by default because two people aren't talking to each other to see if they feel the same way about things. And we're just trying to improve the baseline for everyone when it comes to the tasks that they already do and the time that they spend. That really allows the cultural aspect of it to start to be more of the conversation, which is are we actually already data oriented? We're just not as organized as we'd like to be in how we tackle a lot of those challenges. And I think that that's really where that whole idea of getting more folks involved in the business starts, is just understanding what they might already be doing, but you just don't have the visibility to talk about it across the company the way you would if it was all coordinated from the center.
Have you over the last, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, Ajay, have you seen major shifts in how you think about data teams, how you think about data teams being democratized, even some of the roles that you have, major shifts that you've seen in Powell Industries?
Definitely. I think, you always start with the idea of who's going to be your partner in delivering something, especially if there's a question that needs answering. And you start by asking, trying to kind of narrow down who in the business is going to be really good at being responsive and going to, kind of actively look to work with me to deliver this versus ask me to do something and kind of walk away until I've done it.
Very nice. And your direct team, Ajay, what are some of the roles that you have today? And I ask that question because a lot of times when I look at a team like yours, I'll see architects, engineers, analysts. It's a kind of a group of different skill sets. How do you organize that today, and what are those roles?
So for a while, I'd say we definitely started by saying we want folks to just get their head around what all it takes to be successful with data when you're kind of starting in this newer stack where it was kind of fresh for everyone. But what you find is that then, with everyone trying to get a handle on too many things, no one has room to kind of grow within a certain set of capabilities. So what you find, and I mean, we found certainly more recently that giving people room to grow in more kind of finite spaces really does help, and it helps them actually better collaborators to other folks on the team. So especially in more recent times, that's where we've kind of moved, is to better defining what these roles are and what their accountability is to what we're trying to do. So I mean, some of the names you described, analysts, engineers, but more just explaining where those lines are and what their objectives are a bit better. So that way it's like, well, here's the thing we're trying to accomplish for the business, but then here's your piece of that puzzle so that everyone kind of knows we're not trying to compete with each other over the same things. We're trying to understand how we can each add the most value to getting towards that delivery. So that focus a bit on people, I don't want to say narrowing their skills. That's not really the word I would use. It's more focusing on the things that they can do really well. So that way they can give feedback on whether this would help them do that job better. So, to give you a good example, this has certainly been a more common topic in recent times. This is the idea of developer experience. Of course, we've got a terminology around it, DevX, right? But developer experience when it comes to data has always been a thing, right? Because we've always been talking about those things that, for example, permeated DevOps and how we bring them into the data space. But in some ways, it's very true when it comes to the actual effort associated with developing things in the data space and trying to figure out what reduces the time it takes to put something together because you have those pieces together. Are you jumping between tools too much? Do you need to consolidate the experience some? And allowing people to spend more time doing some of those specific activities. But if they're hopping between activities and it's like multiple weeks in between, they kind of lose the ability to tell you what's actually working really well and what's not. And so that's definitely something we focused on, is giving people room to focus in on those tasks more narrowly versus trying to understand the whole picture all the time.
I think for the individual too, if you can develop that level of specialization around this focus that you're talking about, but you also talked about room to grow if they have interest in another area. As part of that too, I would imagine that they're able to, like if I'm a data engineer working with a data analyst team or working with an architect or working with a business analyst, understanding what they go through, I can develop a level of empathy for their role too that hopefully helps me in my role. But let's say in a business unit, is there generally one or two people there that are really attuned to working with your team, that are easy to work with, that don't sort of create waves, or is it more broad across those business units?
I know we'd all love to just simply train everyone perfectly for everything. It just really doesn't always work that way. So you have to find just kind of more like pockets where you can engage people more. And that's what we're trying to do with those business folks, is give them ways that they can actually engage other people in their functions so that they can kind of nurture that a little bit on their own versus us doing the direct nurturing of those people, if that makes sense. So we're trying to enable, again, even them to do that with other people.
If you have a new team member joining your team, what are the tips that you would give them for being able to facilitate that with the business team? Like, what are the two or three things that I really should make sure I'm doing? And conversely, what are the two or three things never do this with a business unit as part of the data team?
I think the hardest part about doing data, and I mean, I got this advice pretty often at the beginning of my journey with data, was this idea that if you've been used to supporting applications, which I've got a lot of experience with, you're used to thinking that your job is to keep everyone productive all the time, which I mean is true. But when you're doing data, one of the biggest traps about data is that everyone in theory has got some data problem. If you try to go into this thinking you're going to solve every single one, it's somewhat impractical. In data, you really, just because of the way data works, the way the cost of those things work, you really do kind of have to find the right places to start. And you will, if you gather enough momentum, you'll get to those things. If they're important, you will get to them. But if you start by approaching things from the perspective of you're going to get to everything just like you do if you're just supporting people day to day, that approach is just going to split you too thin. And so you're not even going to become really good at solving a problem because you're just looking to kind of give everyone something. Does that make sense? Like, it's kind of the difference between doing it as a hobby and doing it as your actual job. And I'd say that that's kind of one of the things I would probably impress upon them at the beginning is understanding the difference between just supporting people in their job versus supporting people with data and how to actually facilitate that interaction better.
I love that. As you were talking, I was thinking that I think we tend to do that even on the architecture side. Listen, let me have this. Let me build this perfect architecture that's going to handle every use case, every scenario. And to your point, those never practically end up getting built or working or really even being used ever either. So no, I think it's very, very valid. I got to ask you too, skill sets when you look at in going into this year, what do you want to have on your data team? What are those one or two skills or maybe languages or things you need to know that kind of transverse across the team?
When it comes into 2024, I feel like open mindedness about how you achieve what you're trying to achieve, and that the language or being an expert in the language may not be the thing that's really essential. It's understanding how to design with it and how, for example, generative AI may help you in your journey in a way that just being an expert in that language doesn't by default help you solve. Does that make sense? It's kind of like, is the goal to learn the language or is the goal to be successful with the language in a way?
Solve a problem. Let's say I'm on Ajay's team. I'm not an expert in Python. Maybe I know SQL really well, but I've got to do something within the context of Python that's going to help with an outcome I'm trying to deliver. Do you have team members that are starting to use Gen AI in that sense to say, hey, help me out with this Python problem I've got because it is ultimately going to help the company?
Quite frankly, that's something that even when it came to one of my more recent hires, that was one of the questions that previously I would say I didn't focus as much on. And that was something I was more interested in is that how much interest did this person have to grow more in that space already? I mean, not just,
Yeah.
hey, if I come to your team, I want to. It's more something I already have some interest in. And if you give me an opportunity to explore that, I'm interested to explore that further. Because for me, that's more of you already have some basic interest in it regardless of what our needs are. But then the question is if can I expose you to more things that make you understand a path where you could be successful with it and kind of like let's say kind of crawl into it a bit. So a lot of what I do, I confess, I'm sure others are different when it comes to this. If you have bigger teams, is a lot of what my team does are things that, typically are jobs that I am willing to do first to try to figure out what's the default experience need to be for doing it. So I'll freely admit a lot of the questions that when you ask about Gen AI are typically even to me, which is where do I find that I kind of could really accelerate something for myself if I could leverage some. And in doing so, I say, this actually helped me really well to solve this problem and start using that to build some momentum in my team and interest within my team because of how it helped me. Not take it from the perspective of quote unquote, it was easy because I'm an expert in this language and everything else. It's like, no, this is what I did know and here's what I didn't. And this sets of steps helped me bridge that gap because ultimately Gen AI is not going to be a flip the switch and everything's fixed type of thing. It's going to be, you have to find where it fits into your workflow effectively. And there are lots of individual spots in the workflow where it helps. It's just a question of how do you make that experience fit that person's job without it feeling like I got to stop doing something I'm good at, try to do something totally different. And when it doesn't work, I don't have a way to merge back in to what I was trying to accomplish. Because I think for a lot of people, that's more of the part where they feel depressed by that idea that could happen. I'm like, no, the idea is let's find a way that you can integrate it into how you're doing something. And if it works out, great. If not, you can still kind of work through, for example, the idea of building the code yourself. But let's just find a spot where you could ask a question and see what kind of answer you start with.
Yeah, I think we could spend the rest of the show just on what you just talked about. There's a couple of things that stood out to me. Number one, I loved what you said because I'm a big proponent of this as well. I don't think you and I have ever really talked about this, but
Mhm.
not asking your team to do something that you're not willing to do yourself, or at least willing to try, right? You may not
Mhm.
have the skills to do it, but you can give it a try. So that really stood out to me when you said, I think if I was on your team, I would very much appreciate that. I say, look, Ajay's in there with us. He's in the trenches getting this done. Let me transition a little bit. When you're leading a data team, what are the key qualities that someone needs to have? Maybe it's somebody that's looking to move into a leadership role, move into a management role. What do you think based on your experience?
I mean, this sounds kind of silly, but it's true in a lot of spots. Is that always be willing to listen, because sometimes the hardest part of trying to solve problems is that you can get so tied into the way you're trying to solve it that you're just missing more about the problem than you might be realizing, or the ways that the problem could be solved than you may realize. So honestly, I would say just being always being willing to listen, not because you might be totally off, but because there might be nuances you were missing about what it could take to solve something. And I think the idea is always be willing to go a little bit deeper to make sure that you're not just going at it like, oh, I listened. I mean, he said this. I'm like, right, but almost like see if you can reframe the question the way you heard it. I'm used to be really bad about that because I'm not someone who likes hearing things repeated. But sometimes I feel like just forcing myself to repeat it allows me to see if I actually got on top of it. With everyone I work with, that's probably the hardest thing is you get so tied into solving something that sometimes you forget that you might have missed some things and tied yourself down to a particular way of doing something that you didn't have to tie yourself down to.
That's outstanding guidance, Ajay. I think for data leaders, for individual contributors as well within not only data organization but any organizations. I know we're starting to come up on end of time, but I wanted to ask you. So Powell Industries, manufacturing. There's a lot of different types of manufacturing out there. I wanted to get your thoughts before we end, though. Any particular challenges when you look at the manufacturing industry from a data standpoint, uniquenesses there that you've got to address or that you need to be aware of?
I mean, you mentioned we're an electrical manufacturer. We don't mass produce a single design over and over as much per se. Like we do have some common designs, but we ultimately are kind of engineered to order per a requirement. So what that means then is that for any manufacturer, right, you're trying to figure out what's the most effective way to deliver, right? And for some, that means okay, well, we'll do more of the steps in house. Well, since we do not just let's say do the final assembly of some of the equipment, we also do the wiring of the equipment. We also do the procurement ourselves of the products we need. We do fabricate the parts. It's kind of like treating like each one of those things is its own ecosystem of data. And the struggle sometimes is thinking in terms of what's the metric overall. Well, there's a metric overall for the people who need to have the equipment produced. But within that world of producing it, there's a lot of subsets of collecting data that you don't even realize people are doing in their own minds as a part of making decisions. So you're not even realizing that there's more to drill down into. And unless you're actually watching them do it and you ask them about it, you don't realize how much they might just be doing themselves as a part of doing it. And there are ways that you could say, well, are these data points we could actually bring to bear a slightly different way? And I'll go ahead and say this just in the bigger picture. The hardest part about AI for many of us is trying to understand what's the actual reach of it. Like, what of our problems are actually solvable with AI is sometimes a hard thing. I'd say that the thing that being in manufacturing teaches you the most is most problems associated with AI still will always start with a data problem. Do you have enough data to start to answer this question? If you were a person trying to answer it, do you have enough data to answer this? If you don't even know how you'd explain what things might affect something in a basic way, you can definitely try to, let's say, data science your way to a solution. But the only way you'll be able to kind of articulate how the pieces fit is to actually understand if you have enough data about it to really understand why it works the way it does. So I would say in our area, that's probably the thing that I've learned is there's a lot more data to be collected than we may realize, and it is going to take a little bit of that drill down in each area to spot what things we are not collecting still that we need to be collecting, even to have a chance at eventually realizing what AI might be able to bring to bear on that.
Mm. Regardless of the data workload, whether it's AI or something else, I'm hearing you say, I got to have that solid data foundation in place to deliver the data to help solve that. That's outstanding. Hey, last thing, Ajay, we've talked about a lot here, but are there other technologies or, I don't know, approaches that you're thinking about in 2024 that you haven't uh, tested, maybe you haven't tested out previously? Anything else that we haven't talked about that you'd like to mention?
So the only thing I would probably say, um, and I'll say it's a combination of technology. So one of the things I kind of you mentioned the open as far as what I've been focused on is where there's room for consolidation, where there's room for things to kind of evolve. And I feel like in the area when it comes, you mentioned architecture. When it comes to being successful with AI, one of the things we always talk about is the idea of you're starting, for example, with an LLM and you have to do the fine tuning, you have to do the training. And if you wanted to understand your organization, what does that take? Well, I feel like for years, one of the things as part of my journey was the understanding of where modeling really fits into that. And I will say that where we are is being able to articulate how all the modeling that you may have put off doing when it comes to your organization, AI is not going to be forgiving about the fact that you weren't willing to do that part. AI actually will be more of will deliver faster if you recognize the fact that you're literally trying to train someone. If you're trying to train a person to be really successful in your business, how would you do that? Right? If you're going to train it, if you feel like you're going to get to AI without being able to understand how to train it, like really train it on what your business does and what things it would take to do that. So I would say that, especially when it comes to, and I use to look at the field of enterprise architecture, that knowledge about how your business works is something that you need to be successful in operating your business anyway. If you can kind of connect that up to the long-term objective of how you can use that to train an I want to further explore what that could mean. Because I'd say the one part about that's not clear to me is how are you storing what you've captured in the enterprise architecture and in that model to make it useful for it? I don't know exactly what that needs to look like from a modeling perspective, but understanding that I think is probably, at least for us and maybe for several others, one of the key things to understand is what does your data journey need to include if you ultimately want to see long-term success with AI? Not just, as we were talking about, there are a lot of smaller places you can be very successful with things like generative AI, but there's a lot of other AI opportunities, and this is one that I feel like has been critical in the data community for a long time. It's just been understanding why it's important, and I feel like maybe AI will help remind us why it's important when it comes to that trajectory that most companies end up going on to be successful.
Love it. Ajay, insightful as always. It is always a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining the show today.
It was great to get a chance to talk about this stuff. Honestly, so much happens, right? So this
I
has been
know.
great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I look forward to keeping up with all of that new stuff that you talked about going on at Powell as well. And thanks everybody for listening in. We really appreciate each one of you. We'd encourage you to subscribe to the podcast on any of the major platforms, Spotify, Apple, Google, and others. You can also find us on YouTube and visit us at fivetran.com/podcast. Send us any feedback or comments at podcast@fivetran.com. We would love to hear from you soon. Take care.